He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney.
And this is
The Musical Innertube.
Now, you may ask, why is this podcast called The Musical Innertube?
And we may reply, because that's its name, of course.
Now, how did this podcast get that name?
Back in college, we hosted a radio show. Once, we tried to introduce a soothing musical interlude.
Instead, we messed up and wound up introducing a soothing musical innertube, and the name stuck.
So here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking
to interesting people about their interesting lives.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
Today, the Musical Innertube welcomes back an old friend, meteorologist Carl Parker. Carl's been at the Weather Channel since 1999, and in 2011, he joined the expert team where he can be found doing in-studio analysis for major weather events. Carl's also been focusing on extreme weather and climate change for several years. He recently did some graduate work in that area, and he's now coordinating the Weather Channel's climate coverage, and he has graciously decided to take time out of his busy day to talk to us today about that. Hi, Carl. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks so much for having me.
Carl, we are officially into hurricane season now, and we know you know a lot about that. I want to find out from you about some changes that the National Weather Service has done in regards to getting everybody ready. They're now going to a 3-day warning about storm surge, and they're emphasizing the storm surge, which is the water that comes with a hurricane, a little more than they're emphasizing the wind, which has always been a big thing with the hurricane. At the Saffir-Simpson scale is what everybody uses to track a hurricane, and that measures the wind power. But they are much more emphasizing this year the storm surge. Why is that? And do you think 3 days is enough time to warn everybody about a hurricane coming in their direction?
Yeah, I think that modeling has vastly improved in many respects. I mean, we still have difficulty with intensity. We do still have difficulty with track. Certainly Ian indicated that last year. But in terms of the threats, Saffir-Simpson has always been not really adequate for discussing all of the threats from a hurricane. It does tell you how strong the winds are. Generally, when you've got a stronger hurricane, you're going to see more impact in a lot of arenas, but there's some other really important parts of hurricanes that Saffir-Simpson does not cover. One of them is the size of the storm. A very intense, very small storm can cause a lot of wind damage in a really narrow path. Charlie was an example of that. It was really like a large tornado, basically, when it came into Southwest Florida and up through the middle of the state. And in fact, it's interesting, just to deviate for a moment, that actually led to the creation of the extreme wind warning, because as Charlie was coming up through the middle of the state, and the worst of the wind was only about 7 to 8 miles wide, and it was moving towards Orlando, the National Weather Service in Melbourne didn't know what to do to let people know that there was this extreme wind right at the middle of this very small storm. And so they issued tornado warnings, which was a really smart thing to do on the fly for that part of the storm, and because it was going to be tornado-like wind. So certainly you do have this wind threat, but when you've got a much larger storm, you dramatically increase the potential for storm surge. And that was a big difference between Charlie and Ian, which hit just last year. When Charlie came in, it brought a water level rise of 3 or 4 feet to some areas in a relatively narrow area. And then when Ian came in, it was a much larger storm, also very powerful. And so it brought this terrific, 12 plus, 15-foot storm surge in some areas to Southwest Florida. And they hadn't seen a storm like that in a very, very long time. And so, in most people's experience, hurricanes weren't that bad. And so even though storm surge warnings were up a long time ahead of the arrival of that storm, not everybody got off of Marco Island and Sanibel Island, and it was just a devastating storm. So, that was a case where the size of the storm really mattered, and that is not captured by the Saffir-Simpson scale. Another important thing is the forward speed of the storm. And a lot of the modeling has indicated that we are seeing a slight decrease in the forward speed of storms, especially after landfall. It's a little bit of a controversial topic, but there has been some evidence pointing towards that. And that's important because that magnifies all of the impacts. That can mean storm surge over several high tide cycles. That can mean an increase in rain. There's an inverse relationship between the forward speed of the storm and the amount of rainfall that comes down. There's already more moisture in the atmosphere to begin with. If you're slowing down the storm on top of that and getting that much more rain, then you can get these sort of catastrophic flooding events of the type that we have seen in Southeast Texas and also in parts of the Carolinas in recent years. That too is a huge concern, that storms are getting slower. And that's another thing that Saffir-Simpson does not cover. So there's been a lot of discussion in the tropical weather community about, what to do, how to warn, how to communicate these threats, because Saffir-Simpson really isn't doing it.
If storms are slow, if they're slowing down, that gives them more chance to really just hit you with the water, right? Is that what you're saying? There's when you say the slower I go, the more storm I can give you.
Yes, exactly. And water is the number one killer in tropical cyclones. So 75% of fatalities are related to water. About half of those are related to inland flooding. About a quarter are related to flooding on the coast. And so, yes, if you slow a storm down, it's going to produce way more rainfall, and the result is going to be a much greater level of inland flooding. You can also get more storm surge flooding if you get the storm coming in slowly over several high tide cycles. So, the size of the storm is really, really important. The fact that they're getting a little slower is really, really important. And it's also vital to not use your own experience as a frame of reference. And people, naturally, they're going to do that. If you've lived in, some part of Florida for, 40 years, you're going to say, well, we've had this and we've had this, but it never did do this. And you just really can't do that anymore, because things are changing and we're seeing things that we hadn't seen in the recent past. And so it's very important to understand the threats from each individual storm differently. And each storm is different. Every storm is a different monster.
It's so interesting that you say that, because sort of the basis of human reason is to sort of be conservative about experience, to go back on what you saw last time or what you've always seen. And you're telling us that because of the changes in climate, it really, that doesn't work that well anymore. So, what do you do? Do you throw your training out the window? Are you learning a new way to think? It's sort of an interesting situation people like you are put in.
Yeah, we are, definitely, we do see things occasionally that we hadn't seen before, and we have to resist the temptation to dismiss them. One that really stands out to me is Hurricane Sandy, because, what the modeling had been showing is, generally when a storm gets up into the latitude of, your region, the Mid-Atlantic region, and especially, late in October, almost always they race out into the North Atlantic. They're captured by the westerly winds, and they're taken very quickly out into the North Atlantic. And so you get, maybe a glancing blow at the very most. What, the European model was showing was this dramatic left turn. And it was a pattern that was also going to create a lot of evacuation in the atmosphere and make the storm much stronger and make it a hybrid storm, essentially, that was starting to take on non-tropical characteristics. So it was creating this massive storm that was making this bizarre left turn. And when we first saw it in the modeling, many, many days out, a lot of us said, well, that's not going to happen. That's never happened before. Why would that happen? And it really was a shock to see that that's exactly what happened. And it was because there was this very strong ridging in the eastern part of North America. And, that too is something that there's been some research on that we're seeing more of this high latitude ridging. And so it really was a case where we needed to adjust our expectations and to not say, oh, that can't happen, or, that's never going to occur, because the atmosphere is operating differently. And it does indeed make for a challenge in terms of forecasting, because you can't rely on all the historical analogs. You can't look at everything that's ever happened and say, well, this is definitely going to do that. It's not the same atmosphere that it was 40 or 50 years ago.
The people who are in charge of predicting the hurricane season this year have talked about it being about the same as last year, maybe a couple more storms than last year. But last year was a pretty calm hurricane season. And I think part of that is based on the fact that we're shifting from a La Nina to an El Nino. So first of all, if you could remind everybody the difference between El Nino and La Nina and why that would make a difference in the number of hurricanes or the strength of hurricanes that we'd see in the year.
So El Nino is a major driver of climate, natural driver of climate. And what it is a reversal of the trade winds in the equatorial Pacific. And that reversal of the trade winds causes warm water to move from the western Pacific across the central Pacific and into the eastern part of the Pacific. Normally, there's something called upwelling, and that makes the water very cold in the eastern equatorial Pacific. And when that is more amplified, that's a La Nina. So that's the opposite, where you have generally a colder equatorial Pacific, and El Nino is when it's much warmer than average. And that warmth actually injects a lot of warmth into the atmosphere. And it causes this massive reorganization of atmospheric patterns around the globe. And one of them is that we see more ridging, kind of bubbling that occurs associated with that warmth in the eastern Pacific, western part of North America. And we see a concordant reaction to that in the eastern part of North America and across the Atlantic Basin, where we see less ridging and we see lower pressures and more wind shear in the atmosphere. And that wind shear tends to make it more hostile for hurricanes to form. But, one thing that's a little problematic about, talking about hurricane forecasts, I have this discussion with Dr. Rick Knabb all the time. We're not real big fans of the hurricane forecast because while it may generally, very broadly be true that if you get more storms, you could have more impact, and the opposite could be true, you can have terrible impacts with very few storms, and you can have little impact with a lot of storms. 1995 was a year in which we had many, many storms and not much impact in the U.S. 1992 was a year in which we didn't get our first named storm until late August, and that storm was Andrew. So you really just need a little window for a storm to develop. And with temperatures being as warm as they are in the Gulf and the Caribbean and the Western Atlantic, you don't need much. You just need for things to be ideal for, a week or two for a hurricane to develop. And that can happen in any given year, regardless of whether there's more wind shear or not. So it may be that we see fewer storms, but it's definitely troubling that there's so much energy in the water right now. In general, the oceans are very, very warm, and all other things being equal, if the oceans are warmer, that means there's more potential energy for hurricanes, and they can get stronger. And indeed, the trends have been that we're seeing an increase in the proportion of the strongest hurricanes, Category 4 and Category 5, and we're also seeing an increase in rapid intensification. We're seeing that happen more frequently, and it's occurring more quickly.
You can imagine that people want to follow forecasting, though, right? The folks out there watching the Weather Channel, I mean, they sort of, it makes them feel like there's something they might be able to do, right? Give us more of a sense of, that we might not be able to control the storm, but we can get out of its way, or at least put some boards up over the windows, right?
In regards to that as well, do you think more people will be taking advantage of a 2 or 3 day window when there's a warning? We always hear about people going to ride out the hurricane, and the flooding and the wind winds up being too much for them, and their houses come crumbling down or whatever. Do you think more people then would take advantage, especially after the last couple of hurricanes we've had, would take advantage of this warning and evacuate?
Well, we certainly hope so. We hope that people are more hurricane aware. I mean, there's so many things that are converging right now. There's an insurance crisis that's going on right now. We have this increasing intensity of tropical cyclones. There's so many things that are happening at the same time. And we hope that people are taking it more seriously. And with respect to the forecast, the thing that we worry about is that if you tell people, well, we're going to have an El Nino, and so we'll have more wind shear, so we'll probably have fewer storms. We don't want people to say, well, maybe I don't need to do that thing I was going to do this year. Maybe I can put it off until another year when the forecast is higher. Because again, with there being so much warmth in the water, anything can happen at any time, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico is just, I mean, the water temperatures are nuts out there already. They're already in the upper 80s, and they're going to get warmer. And, so you have so much potential energy in the Gulf right now. And so we don't want people to ever say, well, maybe it's not going to be so bad. Our position is that you should be equally prepared every year. And, one thing that we've talked a lot about is sort of taking matters into your own hands and doing what you can do to fortify your home, because yes, you have insurance, but it's getting more expensive all the time. And, then when there's a terrible storm, you might have several months where you're trying to get your home fixed. And so there are little things that you can do. And the main thing that causes problems in hurricanes is wind-driven rain intrusion. And once the envelope is breached, then that can occur, and then it just goes downhill from there. And that usually happens from the roof to the walls. Usually some part of the roof gets peeled back, and that's where it starts, and it goes from there. So, you can get these little clips. These little clips cost, $2 at Lowe's or Home Depot. And if you're handy, you can put them in yourself. These little clips that strengthen that roof wall connection, that can make a huge difference. You can bolster your garage doors. You can get these, shutters for your windows. You can, also make your front door stronger. So, sort of strengthening, fortifying the openings to the home along with that roof wall connection makes a huge difference. And there was this incredible case in Hurricane Michael, which you'll remember was one of the strongest storms to make landfall in U.S. history. And when it came through Panama City, it damaged something like 90% of the structures there. And, 20,000 people were affected by this thing. And in the middle of this wreckage, it was incredible. There were these 5 homes that were built by Habitat for Humanity to the highest standards of hurricane fortification. And for not that much, I think they said it added about 5% to the total cost of the home. They were relatively modest homes, 1-story ramblers, and they had this really strong roof wall connection where there was actually a pin that connected the roof through the wall to the foundation. And they had these, bolstered garage doors and the hurricane shutters and all that. And these 5 homes had no damage. I think there was damage to one AC unit and, some other little minor bit of damage, but they were basically unscathed. In the middle of this sea of trees that had been stripped and homes that were, had lost their roofs and all these blue tarps everywhere. There was another house like that was in Mexico Beach that also came through the storm really, really well. But that home cost a fortune. It was, in the high hundreds of thousands of dollars or something like that. And the point is that it can be done and it doesn't have to break the bank. And so, this is something that we've been really asking people to consider doing, put a few $1,000s of hurricane fortification into your home. And then maybe you don't have to go through all of that. Don't rely on, home insurance. Don't rely on FEMA. You might even get discounts on your insurance to do this, but start taking matters into your own hands if you're in these vulnerable areas. But of course, people do this sort of spatial and temporal discounting where they don't expect things to happen to them. They expect it to happen to other people, but not to them. And that's one of the big hurdles in terms of hurricane preparedness.
People get money to rebuild in the same area after a big storm comes through. And there's always been talk about trying to back that off. I know that the federal flood insurance people have been trying to make flood insurance cover the cost, the real cost of what happens down there. And that seems to be, I don't want to say it's a losing battle, but people love their coastal homes so much that they'll just go right back and build right back on top of where it was destroyed by a storm. And that's kind of counterproductive in my mind anyway. Yeah,
it's not just the people that love it. It's the whole machine that loves it. The local and state officials love it because, the more people that you have buying these really expensive homes, the greater the tax base is. And so it just keeps the whole train rolling. And so, insurance has been underpriced in these high risk areas for decades for exactly that reason. We pay nowhere near the true cost of insurance, but that's just now beginning to change. You guys probably saw that in California, they're not writing policies in some of these high risk areas in the wildland urban interface.
Allstate just said that they would not insure any new property at all in California, for example.
Yeah. Exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is going to happen more and more. And I think we're finally getting to the point where the insurance companies are starting to balk and say, we're just not going to, subsidize this, this living in these high risk areas. And, certainly hurricane zones are among the highest risk areas in the country.
Hi, everyone. He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney. And this is another soothing musical Innertube.
Each week on the Musical Innertube, we talk with interesting people about interesting things.
And we know each and every one of you, the Musical Innertube listeners, are just as interesting.
We'd like to hear from you. Just send an email to musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Or follow us on Twitter at @Innertube, capitalize the M and I.
And then tweet away at us.
You can just check in and say, hi, I'm listening.
You can tell us what you like or don't like about the Musical Innertube.
And if you'd like, you can tell us a little about your own interesting selves.
Perhaps we might share some of your messages on a future Musical Innertube.
Just send those emails to musicalinnertube, all one word, @gmail.com.
Or send us a tweet @Innertube, capitalize the M and I.
We promise to read each and every one of them.
Just as soon as we learn how to read. Well, Carl, we've had a strange situation up here in the Mid-Atlantic. I know John and I both are complaining that our lawns are a little crispy, and I just saw on the local news last night where in our area of Pennsylvania anyway, it is the driest May on record with like 1900ths of an inch of rain that fell the entire month. So, and it doesn't look like there's a couple showers coming over the next couple of days, but it doesn't look like a good soaking rain is going to come for the next couple of days. And of course, we've had that drought out west for years and years, which may be mollified a little bit because of the huge storms they had over the winter. So again, this is all kind of crazy weather. What about a drought situation up here? And will all that rain that they had out west do anything to help the drought out there?
It's been a very interesting year so far. It's been really cool in the Southeast. And, at least a part of that is, I think, related to this developing El Nino and the fact that you're going to have more ridging in parts of the western part of the U.S. and then a little more troughiness in the eastern part of the U.S. And so with that, you tend to see a northwesterly flow and, less wet weather in general. But, the broader picture is that we are also seeing this, a vivid illustration of what's called the amplification of the water cycle. And that is basically more evaporation occurring. And when more evaporation occurs over the oceans, that puts more moisture into the air. And in general, warm air has more capacity to hold moisture. So we're seeing about 7% more water vapor in the atmosphere for every 1 degree Celsius of warming. And we're already up to about 1.2 right now. And then when evaporation occurs over land, it very easily gets rid of the water that's in the land. When you look at the total amount of water on the planet, 97% of it is in the oceans. Something like 0.001% of it is in soil. Very, very tiny amount of water in soil, relatively speaking. And so it doesn't take much to get rid of it when you have these very dry periods. And so, there's no place that's more indicative of this amplification of the water cycle than California. They've always had, forever, they've had these swings in precipitation, where you go back and forth from dry to wet because it's an arid climate generally, but they're also right next to this huge ocean. And so when conditions are right, they can get a lot of storms coming in with a lot of moisture. But we're seeing a widening of those ranges, and that is called hydrologic whiplash. And so, this is something that we expect to see more of in the future, a greater experience with drought while simultaneously seeing a greater experience with flooding. And, certainly that's going to be very problematic for a lot of areas.
We live out near the country here, and I went to a farmer's stand, which I like to frequent because I get the chance to talk to the farmers who are hanging out. And one of them said to me, it has been really, really dry. We haven't gotten much rain the last 3 or 4 weeks, really. And April and the beginning of May had some rain, but since then it's been very, very dry. And now we're starting to have the first heat wave. It probably is going to be up to 90 in the next couple of days. And, well, they're worried. That's what they say. They're business people. They look at the weather. They're right in contact with the weather as a class of business people. And, they, I think, are believers in climate change because they see it happening. And
yeah, I mean, both things are true. They're probably more aware as a group than most people about how the weather is changing because that's their life. I mean, that's their livelihoods, and they've been counting on certain weather patterns for, years and decades, and now they're beginning to change. So they see that it's happening, but they're also, yes, reticent as a group to accept the idea of climate change. And, sometimes they prefer to, just refer to it as weather patterns changing. But, what we're actually seeing is, some movement of the needle there. And there was a really interesting study out of the University of Chicago from several years ago. And what it showed is that of the people that had changed their minds about climate change in the last 5 years, the vast majority of them did so because of direct experience, because they were seeing things that they had not seen before. And so that is a very powerful thing. I can stand up here all day long and talk about how this is changing and that's changing. But when you become, acutely aware of, how the weather is just not operating the same way that it always did, I mean, that's it. That tells you right there that something is different.
You'll notice, too, if you watch television at all, that a lot of the commercials from the car dealerships are emphasizing their electric vehicles. And that brings up an interesting question. And you have said in the past, Carl, that one of the things that's going to move us towards positive reaction to climate change is just the movement of corporations, seeing where that's going to open up a new business for them. And it's going to open up more money for them. And it's going to open up a whole new side of their business that they hadn't counted on before. And that looks like what's happening with electric cars now, that the automakers are embracing it and really starting to push it. Do you think that that's one of the reasons there is that they look to the future and see electric cars and want to be in on it?
Yeah, there are a lot of really exciting things that are happening right now. We talk about negative tipping points in climate, areas where, things start to happen and it becomes very rapid, whether that's deforestation in tropical regions or whether that's, ice loss, ice mass loss, that kind of thing. But there are also positive tipping points. And we are absolutely seeing that in renewable energy right now. It is growing by leaps and bounds, especially in other parts of the world, in Europe and also in China. We are seeing now that the EVs are taking off. There's this thing called the S-shaped adoption curve. And every new major technology has followed this pattern in history, whether it's cell phones or smartphones or, LED screens, whatever the case is. This is all, followed this pattern where once you reach 5% market penetration, then usually it takes off. And that's exactly what happened in Norway. I think something north of 60% of all new cars in Norway are now EVs. And so it's happening right now. All of the major automakers are making plans to move to EVs. I just got an EV last September. I can tell you that it's just a better driving experience. I mean, I just like it more. It's quieter and it's smooth and it's, I don't know how to explain that any more than that. I mean, it's just a different thing. There's this thing called, for example, one pedal drive where you accelerate and then as you lift off the pedal, it begins to brake. And it's so good at doing that you never use the brake. And it's much, much easier to drive that way. When you have a lot of stop signs or a lot of traffic or a lot of lights, it's so much easier to drive that way. You almost aren't thinking about it. So, in a lot of ways, these things are better. We got an induction stove also last year. That's much better. It's way easier to cook on once you get used to it. So, I do think that there are a lot of things that are changing very quickly. But, one thing I wanted to add is that a lot of the things that people think are like the main things to do to reduce their climate footprint are not necessarily the main things to do. And there's a fascinating group called Project Drawdown. And what they do is they've analyzed the potential climate impact of various things that you can do. And they found that, that a lot of the things that you think about, like recycling and electric cars, wind and solar, might be near the top or maybe the middle of the pack, but some of the very most impactful things, at least on a global scale, are a lot of unexpected things. One of them, like number 4 on their list of about 90 solutions in terms of impact, is refrigerant management. Finding a way to properly dispose of your refrigerators and your AC units, because the chemicals in those hydrofluorocarbons are so powerful. There's something like 4,000 times more powerful than CO2. And so if we just crush those in the dump and release that, then that's going to be a huge problem. Number 2 is plant-based diet. And this is something that we did several years ago, and we've had no problem doing it because there's so many great alternatives now. Number 1 is food waste. And when you think about all the energy that goes into growing, raising, processing, transporting, storing, marketing food, there's a lot of energy in every single bite. And we toss about 35 to 40% of our food every year. So we're losing so much energy. And that's their number 1 solution for reducing emissions. But I also want to point out that this idea that it's kind of all on us is not true. There was a study that came out several years ago that found that something like 80 companies were responsible for almost all the emissions that have occurred. And I mean, that's incredible when you think about it. I mean, so it is important for us to reduce our own carbon footprint, but that's not the most powerful lever. The most powerful lever is to see this really systemic change, this move into renewable energy in general. And I think that's occurring now in large part because it's cheaper. It's just cheaper to put up solar plants and to put up wind farms. And because once you've gotten over that initial capital cost, then the costs come way, way down. I mean, you think about it like a solar, I know you guys have seen that, these solar plants. And once you've set that up and you've spent all that money, then you're done. Then you don't have to do anything. You don't have to maintain it and constantly fix it, which is not the case with a lot of power plants that have a lot of moving parts. So, I do think there are a lot of ways in which we're moving very quickly into a good space. The only question is, are we doing it quickly enough? And we really need to be on it, yesterday.
Yeah, because what was it you said? If we get up to an increase of 2 degrees as far as planet warming, that we're in a really dangerous area. And I guess we're up to the last I heard, we were up to 1.5. Is that about where we are?
Well, that depends on the scale that, the time period that you're looking at. We may hit 1.5 over smaller periods, but in terms of an annual basis, I think we're closer to 1.2 right now. Although, this next year is going to be, we'll see how it goes because, typically when you talk about temperature rise, it's not linear. It's more of a, sort of a stair-step thing where La Nina years tend to be a little cooler and El Nino years tend to be warmer. And the last big one was 2015, 2016. We had, what is called a super El Nino. And El Ninos, by the way, have been getting stronger. The last several very strong El Ninos have been stronger successively. And so, each of these events releases a terrific amount of warmth into the atmosphere. And so we do expect that, late 2023, 2024 are probably going to be very warm, will likely be the warmest years on record because, the baseline trend is increasing, but then you're on the, one of those steps, basically, when you're in an El Nino, and we expect that it's going to be quite warm as a result.
But we are headed in the right direction overall. If we keep at it, slow and steady going to win the race, or do we need to make some big jumps here in the next couple of years?
I really don't know. I mean, it's part of the problem is something called the carbon emissions gap. And what that tells us is that to be on, I think unfortunately that the 1.5 C trajectory, I think that ship has sailed. I don't think we're going to be able to get that. If we want to try to limit warming to 2 C, every year that we don't, so what that requires is like an immediate drawdown of CO2 all around the world. And because, there's this thing called the stock flow model of carbon emissions. And basically you're putting more, and you can use a bathtub as an example. You're putting more water into the tub every single year. And so, if you reduce the flow of water that's going into the tub, you're not filling the tub as rapidly as you were, but you've also got to drain the tub. It's not good enough just to stop the flow because you've already filled the tub. And that's what we've done. We've filled the atmosphere with all of these emissions. So we have to really draw it down very quickly to get there. And to get on that 2C trajectory would require a dramatic change in emissions. And every year that we don't do it, the slope becomes steeper. So, if, for example, we wait until 2030 to really start doing it, then it's going to require an even steeper slope to draw it down. So that's the problem, is that we're in a very critical period right now, and we're not changing emissions as quickly as we should be. But again, I'm encouraged by the fact that we do have these positive tipping points where, companies, utilities are moving really quickly into renewables because it's financially smart to do so. And there are other areas, EVs and other things that are really starting to take off. And so I do think that we're, seeing a lot of ways in which there's a shift occurring now. But, where those curves meet and how they cross, that's the question. I just don't know where we're going to be on that.
We'll return to our talk with Carl in just a moment, but first, this soothing musical interlude.
Carl Parker joined the Weather Channel as an on-camera meteorologist in 1999. He joined the expert team in 2011, where he could be found doing in-studio analysis for major weather events. Carl has also been focusing on extreme weather and climate change for several years, and after recently doing graduate work in that area, is now coordinating the network's climate coverage.
From 1995 to 1999, Carl was with KPRC-TV in Houston, Texas, gathering both personal and professional experience with tropical storms and hurricanes. Prior to Houston, Parker worked for WHTM-TV and WHP-TV in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. He began his career in 1991 at WTVA-TV in Tupelo, Mississippi, while working on his BS in Geosciences at Mississippi State University. He also has a graduate certificate in climate adaptation from NC State University and holds the American Meteorological Society's seal of approval.
You can follow Carl by tuning in to the Weather Channel or by visiting their website, weathergroup.com.
And now, back to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
So one thing about El Nino that is not often discussed is the role of El Nino in migration. You see all this coverage about the crisis on the southern border, and I see story after story after story after story, and none of it discusses why. Why are we seeing this problem on the southern border? And there's been a real shift in recent years. For years and years and years, the largest demographic of people that were coming to the southern border were single Mexican men who were looking for economic opportunity. Over the last several years, there has been a huge rise in family units and minors from Central America. Why is that? Well, there's this region called the Central American Dry Corridor, and it's a region that is typically very dry, but even more so during El Nino. And when we had this super El Nino in 2015 and 2016, what it did is it dried out the crops so profoundly that there were 2 million people of the 10 million or so that are in the Central American Dry Corridor, 2 million that were experiencing severe food insecurity. So you could say, well, why don't they just leave a lot of these people, by the way, are subsistence farmers, which means they grow what they eat. And if they can't grow their food anymore, then they've got to find an alternative. And you could say, well, why don't they go to the cities? Well, turns out the cities in these countries, particularly in El Salvador, also in Honduras and Nicaragua, are some of the most dangerous in the entire world. A lot of these cities have had some of the highest homicide rates in the entire world. There's this huge risk of extortion and kidnapping and assault. And so, typically when these family units come to the southern border of the U.S., they have exhausted all of their possibilities. They started out as farmers in rural areas in the CADC, and then they try the cities and they realize that, oh my gosh, there's no way I can do this. And so they go on this arduous, 2,000-mile journey to the southern border of the U.S. And so I think that this is not discussed frequently enough, because this is going to be a huge push factor. We're going to see more of this kind of thing. I'm really worried about what's going to happen in the next year or so, because, the last time, if you look at the numbers, we had this super El Nino in 2015 and 2016. And right after that, we saw this very dramatic rise in migration from Central America from 2017 through 2018, 2019, pause in 2020 because of the pandemic, and then back again right on that same curve in 2021. And so because El Nino, and I could explain the mechanism that does this, but, because El Nino leads to a drying, even in the rainy season in these areas, as El Ninos possibly get stronger, and certainly generally as there's more evaporation occurring overall, because it's warmer and drier, we're going to see more of this push factor from these countries through Mexico and towards the southern border of the U.S. And so the upshot is that we're going to need to figure this out. We're going to have to, find a way to come up with some sort of humane policy framework to figure out what to do, because it's not going to get better. It's not going to go away. More and more people from these tropical regions will come north.
Yes, and I don't believe that there is an administrative categorization for climate migrants. We have people who are, asking for asylum because of political reasons, and we have that kind of thing. But we don't right now honor the classification that you're talking about, and probably is responsible for just tens of thousands of people trying to cross our borders, is that they can't grow the stuff they used to grow. I think a change of only a couple of degrees, for example, in Guatemala, has made it harder and harder to grow bananas. Yeah, and easier for the bananas to develop a mold which actually loves bananas. So all these things are really bad for bananas, and the people who grow those things, they can't make a living anymore.
Right. And for as horrifying as the policies of the last administration were, the current administration has not been great when it comes to asylum. There's a backlog of something like 2 million cases. And, each of these cases takes 4 years on average to resolve, because they need hundreds more judges than they have right now. So, we're not dealing with this, and people have, demonized these people, which is also, I think, a mistake, because, when you look at, what so many immigrants come and do, they take all the jobs that nobody else wants to do a lot of times. And if you get them on the books, then they contribute to the tax base, which helps out with our, our social programs, that whether they're viable or not. So I really hope that we can get to a place where we can have a conversation about why this is happening, not just this is happening and we've got to stop it and we've got to seal everything up. We need to understand why, because this is going to be a big deal. It's only going to be more of an issue. And by the way, this is exactly what happened in Europe. You can draw a straight line from migration from Syria, where there was the worst drought that they had seen on record, to Brexit, because people were so upset that all these people were coming from, Middle Eastern regions. That's a big part of why they voted for Brexit. And that was related directly to the intensity of the drought, which is related to climate. So, we're seeing all these signs of how climate is leading to socio-political instability and unrest, which, by the way, is something that the Department of Defense has known about for years. They've understood this very, very well. So you have national security and, policy issues that really need to be dealt with. And demonization is not going to get us anywhere. It's only going to make things much worse, I think.
That's a great way of showing that everything is intertwined and all of this stuff needs to be tackled in a most immersive way rather than just pinpointing individual things and trying to like slap every little whack-a-mole that's coming up, as opposed to coming up with one big overreaching policy that will take care of all of that. So thanks for that, Carl. That's very enlightening. And you're right. I think it's all intertwined. We have to get everything under control at the same time in order to see these things stop being emergencies.
What was that Churchill said about Americans? We always do the right thing, but only after exhausting all of the possibilities. I mean, I think that, I think that might be where we are.
Definitely. Well, Carl, thanks again for getting us up to speed on what's happening out there.
Terrific. Yeah.
We'll keep our eye on it and get back to you in a little while and see how it goes. Thanks, Carl.
Absolutely. Happy to join you.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Our lovely little podcast is available everywhere good podcasts are found. Listen on your favorite platform, and if you like what you hear, please give us a good rating.
And spread the word. Tell your friends about the Innertube and let them know they can subscribe to the podcast on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
There you can listen to all of our podcasts, see pictures and biographies of our guests, and contact us. You can even click on the microphone button in the lower right corner to leave us a voicemail.
And don't forget to leave your email address on our Talk to the Tube page so we can stay in touch.
And you can email us directly at musicalinnertube@gmail.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.